I got the Rona.
Yeah. Did you actually have the Rona, or were you just sick?
I lost taste, which was really weird. I mean, I got really mild symptoms. No fever, none of that stuff. I completely lost taste. My wife got pretty sick. Like, she got pretty nasty.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but never turned into like much of a cough. So there is an association with the common cold and losing taste, but pretty confident it was the Rona.
Well, if you didn't get tested for it or anything, you're just kind of
well, because the symptoms were so mild.
Yeah.
I mean, she had like one really bad day and a few tired days, and then it was over.
Everyone that I know that's gotten it has been more your case.
Yeah.
I don't really know anybody that's had like really bad symptoms.
Oh, we know one guy. Yeah, there's one guy we know that got really bad symptoms.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But
I probably just haven't talked to him.
Went to a hospital and all that kind of stuff. But it's been a long time since you've seen him.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But still, I mean,
I think I know what you're talking about.
That's the thing about public policy is that it's not about the individual. It's about the group. How do you do policy for the mean of society or enough people? And maybe the right way to think about it.
Did you see Tom Woods got his video taken down on his speech about Corona?
Yeah. So for people who don't know, Tom Woods he's a Columbia trained historian.
Yes.
And PhD.
Mises Institute.
Wrote
guy.
Quite a few bestsellers, great books, and podcaster for the last couple of years, and has really become a talented podcaster. And he did a speech on the Corona response, and just
with tons of data in it, and they fact checked him all with very bad fact checking. like it's just the shocking thing is just very poorly done fact checking.
Right.
But because it was in response to the Corona and it doesn't go with popular opinion, it violated YouTube's terms of services.
And this is something that I've wanted to talk about on the podcast. What is science? What is it? And like why are we using? So we've talked about a little bit about like knowledge and sense making. I need to stop. That's shaking everything.
Yeah. We've
talked a little bit about knowledge and sense making, but what is the role that science is supposed to play? So, and what are your thoughts on that? Do you feel like science is being abused in this, or
I don't think that there's a lot of science that's actually. I don't think that a lot of people are actually sciencing. Like science is an excellent tool with the scientific method, but most things are just politics and narratives. It seems like to me.
Yeah.
Like we have somebody that fits a certain narrative that fits a specific political aim. Says something, so that is now stated true. 2 months later, that is like, that's actually not true, but everyone just kind of ignores that and pretends like that never happened. It's like, we have a new truth now, and that's been the case of this entire Corona fiasco that we've been living in. So it's just like I don't really like everybody's saying trust the scientists, but the question is which scientists? Like, there's a lot of scientists that are very well accredited that are getting completely censored on platforms, right?
And so it begs the question: what's science supposed to be? What are we shooting for? What is the ought? What is the proscription for how this should work? We're not talking about that anymore. We're either talking about how it's wrong for people to get censored, right? Which is a good conversation to have, or we're talking about how people are giving out misinformation, bad information to people intentionally to try to do a political thing. I think there are three thinkers that need to be brought into this conversation to really nail the ought. Like, what's the situation we're shooting for?
But one of the problems before we get to that though is like, there's nobody really seems to want to get to the ought, and we can't even agree on what the is currently is, right?
Right. Well, I mean, you don't think I have to have perfect agreement in order to bring up what the ideal is.
But major figures that drive opinion making seem to be all kind of in the space, and there seems to be I don't know what's going on.
That's why you need to like and share this podcast with your friends. Oh, my name is David Herbst, by the way.
Yeah, we need to be better at that. My name is Kyle Mack, and this is the No Strings Podcast.
Yeah,
and we're still kind of beta testing this thing out, but we're among friends and whatnot. But we're going to start pushing. Now we're on many platforms than just YouTube.
Yeah, we got an RSS feed that you can subscribe to. I found mine on the Google podcast.
Is it up on Google now?
I thought I saw it on.
Okay, well, it's up on Google now.
Yeah.
Last I checked, it still was not up on Google.
Shoot. So are we on iTunes yet? I know there was approval on that.
iTunes apparently is having problems with accepting people onto their website for podcast connections right now.
Wow.
It's apparently been an issue.
And it will be on Spotify?
It is on Spotify. It is on Amazon.
Oh, that's what I meant with Spotify. I said Google, but I meant Spotify.
Yeah, no.
Sorry.
I was still waiting for acceptance on Google. But yeah, no, Spotify, there's a few others. There's like 10 others.
Well, we're going to get around this big tank censorship of not hosting our podcast by creating an account and uploading it.
It's pretty, because I've already apparently been targeted by censorship quite heavily.
That's true.
My Facebook has been silenced for
still down.
This Wednesday or Thursday it'll be officially a month.
Wow.
So on my second account, my first account was just completely banned outright. Can't be on Instagram. Same company, I guess, but yeah. So yeah, speaking of that, because I think all of these things are tied together with information that's allowed to be heard throughout society. Right.
So do we feel like we've nailed the is in the moment? Like, have we captured it? We talked about it a couple different times on the podcast. The ought, I think, are three thinkers. One is Karl Popper. 2 was Robert Polanyi. And 3, that guy.
Hayek.
F.A. Hayek. So Karl Popper.
I wonder what side of this argument that we're on.
Well, I mean, this is I don't see how anyone doesn't support this, right? Like it's one of those things that I think there's so much agreement on, we kind of leave it behind and we focus on other things. But to just kind of return to that and then reapply it to the given situation, it produces a lot of explanatory power. So one of the things that Karl Popper said was that you need science to be something that is a dialogue, that's a competitive dialogue of falsifiable claims, right? Claims that can be proven as false. So if you split a hydrogen atom, what happens, right? That is, you have a theorem, E equals mc squared, that predicts what will happen if you plug in all of those parts of the theorem, right? And that's how we get a hydrogen bomb. The underlying theory of how matter and energy work, that is a falsifiable claim that is then tested against real world evidence. How do you do that in a pandemic? That's the question. Do we have the world where Sweden locked down versus the world where Sweden didn't lock down? And that problem of complexity and of not being able to compare apples to apples, like the same population across the same period of time with different policy outcomes, is where Hayek comes in. That problem of how social sciences struggle to do what the physical sciences do, that it's not the same thing. And what Hayek claimed was that there's this propensity to equate those two, and then to then make these kind of broad appeals to science as a knowledge structure to justify whatever you wanted to justify as scientism, right? Using science like a club to get your social agenda across by treating science as social sciences like, economics and political philosophy or political theory as the same thing as the physical sciences, chemistry or biology or things like that. Why can't we do that is the key question, right? And that is a ton of investigation to be done there.
Well, I think it's very correlational to what we've talked about before about the idea of political atheism. Like, I think that there's even a scientific atheism that needs to be had of realizing that most people are just trying to confirm their biases. That's what I mean, and we're guilty of this too. Like, everybody's like, we have these general preset structures in our heads and these like logical frameworks of how the world operates. So most people aren't taking an objective look at things. Most people act in a very subjective way of just like, and they'll blank out any information if they're not being open to new dialogue, new information. They're just going to blank out different things that don't fit their current narratives. It's like, okay, ignore that thing because it doesn't help me do what I'm trying to accomplish. It doesn't help me feel all good inside. It doesn't make my dopamine go off in a certain way. And so people just kind of, if somebody comes with presenting their information, the information that already justifies all their things, that person's going to be of praise. That person's going to be praiseworthy. If somebody doesn't, that person's dangerous now.
So like the use of knowledge in society question is that's the Hayek's question. But then like the Robert Polanyi then comes in, and that's where he comes in. No individual actor in that system of knowledge acquisition of like scientists or the general public interacting with the science has to be perfect in order to create this knowledge structure that benefits society, where you have competing ideas fighting it out. Now, the only difference about that is that what's required for that to happen is a state of freedom, right? Is a state where you're not being censored by the government. I got construction going on.
Yeah.
We might have to cut this shorter. Although it's going to get kind of loud.
There's construction outside. I saw that coming in.
So 3 different thinkers, Popper, Hayek, and Robert Polanyi, all contribute a lot, and especially from that time period of the late 19th century up until the 1950s and 60s, a tremendous amount of writing was done about what is this thing science? What is the values that create it? What is it, and why as an institution does it make the world better off? And I think there's a good case to be made, like the innovation that happens around science that actually that creates science and is created by science. Matt Ridley is by far doing the most important work in that space. And each one of these thinkers all will tell you the same thing. It's a state of freedom where you're not censored by the government or given privileges to have your scientific theory or your innovation biased in the marketplace. It's by allowing things to compete that we discover the truth. And one of the interesting things about that is that in this current environment where we're censoring everything, we're preventing the best ideas from rising to the top. Some of that is obviously soft censorship, right? It's criticism, right? It's the I'm going to not just say I think you're wrong. I'm going to say you think you're a bad person for even talking about it. That is a value thing. A society that values free engagement with ideas, even ideas you disagree with, and like good faith argumentation, is going to discover quicker and more effectively the best policy to pursue as a group. That's the idea. That's the ought that we should be shooting for.
Yeah, and a bit of a diagnosis of the is, because like I think you need a good diagnosis of the is to kind of try to get to an ought, because you need to know what problems are before you actually get there.
Right.
It's like there might be room for a postmodernist critique on what's going on right now, because in a lot of ways, at least what I've been seeing throughout 2020, but like you see this everywhere, you see it throughout academia, is a lot of things that are going on are people just putting narratives forward and with no really means of basis. And it seems to be just a lot, not all the time, but a lot of it just seems to be like power for power gaining or prestige gaining or whatever. And it's like, do you just need, like, how do you get to the ought? Do you put systems in place to try to prevent that?
Well, it has to be bottom up. So that, the best thing about this is, man, is that an Ayn Rand idea, right? What the government tends to do is create conditions of privilege. That's what government is.
Yeah.
Is a giant privileged institution. It gets to do things that normal people can't do, like tax you.
Monopolies on privilege.
Right. So if you walk in knowing that about government, you're much more likely to be able to identify the problem with censorship, or identify the problem with how knowledge is being used in society. Because what we want is individuals to take on the burden of trying to be seekers of truth, of trying to realize the truth as an end, as a goal, right? And not being power seekers. Because in the vacuum of having an ethic of saying, I care about what's true, not just about my personal power or about my tribe's win in the political game, what I care about is truth and virtue in these other ideas. Those can't happen. One cannot be created by government. You can't create a virtuous people by law. And two, you have to have individuals taking on the responsibility to become that person individually. Because otherwise there is no, and that has to happen as an emergent order phenomena. Otherwise, you don't create the conditions for those values to reinforce that institution called science. Emergent order phenomena. Should I define that?
Yes.
Do you want to take a crack at it?
No, you're more. This is more stuff in your wheelhouse. Yeah.
So emergent order phenomena are things that build themselves on its own. So imagine for a moment the idea of Darwinian evolution is this idea that things change in relationship to its environment over time, again, according to certain pressures. selection pressure, environmental pressure, sexual selection pressure, all kinds of things will change the biological outcomes on their own without any central planner, right? So the idea that there is an agency that's made a watch, right? So you find a watch on a beach and it's working, or it's not working, but it's functioning. And you say, well, there must be a watchmaker. That's true for a lot of things, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not true of many things. Like, for example, who made the watch? How many people made the watch? Well, sure, there was one person who assembled all the components, but where did they get the metal? Where did they get the battery? Mm-hmm. How was the battery mined? The systems that created the conditions for the watch themselves were not centrally planned by anybody. That's how the economy works, a free market economy. That's why socialism fails, something we could talk about someday. And that is why a lot of ideas are actually very synergistic with emergent order phenomena, things that emerge on their own. And one other way to think about it, and this is the way that I've been thinking about it a lot lately, is it's the opposite of entropy. Entropy is where you have a system, any kind of closed system will steadily break down over time. What emergent order phenomena are, or when you have open systems and new energies inputted into a system, things will spontaneously build themselves along certain lines and incentives. So both like where the price of wheat comes from, to like how matter is arranged in the universe, to how stars and solar systems are formed, all or even ideas like consciousness are all emergent order phenomena.
So, okay. So I guess the question is, because we're at the point that we're at right now where we're seeing all this stuff, like what is the answer to moving forward? Like what should be getting pushed for people? Because right now we're seeing, cries for government to step in, for, in academia on what's being taught, for government to come in and kind of take control over social media in various aspects, for allowing various opinions to come in. I'm doubtful on that actually being going to be working out in the long run. Is like, what do we, as like free thinkers, as independent people, as libertarian-minded people, what do we push forward? Like, how do you get that type of a message across that is like, oh, you just kind of let things go, you let things operate, you allow for things to emerge spontaneously.
You don't just do that. You also embody in yourself and advocate for other people to take up and to embody those values too. Right. The solution to how you stop a bottom-up problem of values or a top-down problem is more bottom-up, right? Is encouraging individuals to take on the responsibility of changing their society, of reforming their government, or of embodying those values and principles differently. If you find yourself orientated towards the unknown or new ideas with immediate sense of, I don't understand that, so I don't like it. You don't have to be that way. You can open yourself up to those ideas without losing something important, like your identity, right? And a lot of people, that's how they kind of orientate themselves to the world. The choice to approach those situations differently will not only make your life better, more rich and interesting, but it will also it will empower the system and the society that we have to better react to danger in situations like we have right now, with a greater dose of skepticism towards the empowered elites telling us everybody what to do.
Which is, and this is something that I've always been saying, is one of my optimistic points for recent years and everything we've been seeing is, despite everything that's going on, politics and all this stuff, I'm getting increasingly encouraged by just general population skepticism of all of these institutions that we've been trained to just wholeheartedly take in 100% on everything. I think skepticism is a very healthy, very, very healthy thing for society. And the more people that are kind of beginning to resist the influence of a lot of these institutions, and the more creative destruction I think we're going to begin seeing. For instance, like a lot of this COVID stuff, because we've been under COVID lockdowns for what, since April, end of March, early April. A I was pessimistic at first, seeing just how many people were going through with things. People that I generally would think are very free thinkers, independent people that are just like, oh, gotta listen to the experts. And right now, and like in some degrees, yeah, listen to the experts, but in other degrees, it's like there seems to be large power grabs over our freedoms. But now I'm beginning to see, we're starting to see just civil disobedience and people resisting.
I think
a lot of these.
I think the initial sense of fear, that psychological sense of like, oh man, this could be really bad. How do we come together and solve this problem is legitimate. It's good human emotion. And people being willing to be like, okay, I'm going to listen to you because you are the expert in this area. But that can only last so long before someone says, well, wait a minute, there are trade-offs. And this is another like core lesson that like if we could inject an idea into public discourse at a given time, in real reality, there are trade-offs and negotiations between values, especially in political or policy questions.
Well, it's just I feel like because these types of things keep happening, they seem to be happening at an increased rate. Where there's this massive public outcry, fear for something, and then there's a response for. Like 9/11 is an example of this. Patriot Act coming in, so we have to go to war. We have to amp up NSA spying, all of these things. 2008 economic crisis, all of a sudden all these economic controls come in. People are becoming much more and more skeptical of these big fears that are coming in. And the pushback is happening sooner, it seems to be, each time one of these happens. And that's one of my calls for optimism, because it's one thing that I kind of see happening is I feel like we're just going to have parallel societies beginning to form of people that accept certain opinions and other people accept other opinions. We're going to end up seeing just people like new echo chambers forming onto different social media platforms, and just like in these areas, certain people are going to be allowed voice, other people aren't. And in other spaces, certain people are going to be allowed voice, others aren't. And we're going to have almost like dueling opinions in that regard. Outside of normal institutional practices. There's going to be new institutions that form that have ideas and science and opinions that kind of flood through, but we're seeing a radical change, I think, and we're seeing the beginnings of that.
So a couple key ideas to break down there is one, creative destruction, and two, what do we mean by institutions? So
that's a good question.
Creative destruction is that process in which things are, because of the evolutionary pressure into society, things, a business or a business model or a institution in this case, crumbles because it's no longer able to survive in the current environment for whatever reason, and a new one is created. Robert Sumner is the kind of coin of the term, and it was his idea that that's what the market does. It takes down institutions. Schumpeter, not Sumner.
I never know how to pronounce his name.
Schumpeter.
Schumpeter.
Yeah, that idea that there is that there's a force in society, that emergent order force itself destroys and creates new things to solve
and it's not just necessarily like businesses deteriorating and the new businesses prop up. Like it's just an aspect of kind of all aspects of life. Like ideas experience creative destruction, like entire societies will experience creative destruction. Like this happens on a very micro level, but also a very macro level. Like it's just kind of, it's like the general cycle of processes in any given process is breakdown, new things emerge.
The exception in emergent order processes, not all processes, right? For example, governments do not change. They don't emergently,
a lot of time
destroy.
A lot of time, entities try to put systems in place to stop the breakdown from happening.
Right.
But often what that ends up doing is it stops the new innovations from happening as well.
Right.
And you end up stagnating.
Right.
Technology, ideas, culture, whatever. Like those elements will begin to stagnate if you try to put these systems to not allow things to break down.
A great example is Cuba. Right. Cuba itself has frozen at the time of implementation of communism for a reason.
They are stuck in the 1950s.
Right. Technology-wise, aesthetics, all sorts of things have evolved in other places because of relative amounts of freedom. Another example, in Russia, for example, froze from the 1920s till 1918, 1913, the revolution, to 1990. There was very little progress over that time. very slow progress as compared to the West. The reason why is because the energy of that system, the more control you have, the more force and violence you have, the more that energy is diverted away to static things and away from that. So there's an important psychological component of that. Openness itself is the thing that creates the conditions for cultural evolution, right? And what that does is it makes conservatives very uncomfortable, right? Because some of that cultural evolution is going to mean, our values are going to change, right? And that's understandable, both that you would want values to change, right? So that to adapt to new circumstances and new environments, but also too that you want to maintain the good values of the past that civilization was built on. And so tremendous amount of dialogue is in that psychological conflict between that conservative.
And that's kind of the yin yang too, because often liberals, there's always, I don't know, certain terminology is always kind of weird. Progressives, I think, is probably more appropriate for what I'm about to say. Often there's elements of wanting to push things too far too, and there's almost elements of being too open, because you might be pushing things into a very bad direction.
Right.
So like there's this element of like balance that needs to be stricken there if you want to move things in a, because like I want to stay away. I think oftentimes libertarians that are talking about creative destruction and innovation and stuff like that often kind of get into a naturalistic fallacy, where it's just like, just because things evolve doesn't always mean that they're good.
Yes.
And that's always kind of a dangerous line to like, there needs to be some sort of control, and I don't mean like a governmental control, but just like a cultural control that does exist on like, where are we heading in certain avenues.
It's a yin yang, it's a balance. Yeah, it's a push, right? You have these two opposing forces, supply and demand, or in this case, like the conservative impulse to maintain the boundaries and coherence of civilization, and the progressive push to broaden the boundaries so that we can capture more energy, be more innovative, create more, right? I don't really mean progressive in that sense. I actually mean liberal, like the old school liberal concept ideas of growing those boundaries. Now, where maybe there's a distinguishment is that there's a certain amount of, in the progressive movement especially, of saying, well, we actually don't think that there's any yang to the yang, right? The liberal itself, like classical liberal, have always admitted that there is a limit to that we were trying to negotiate through free speech. It's through persuasion that we decide where the line is between those two forces. It isn't in control. It isn't in saying the government's going to legalize absolutely everything, right, at any given time, radically overnight. It's through persuading people about the ethics of a situation. And I think there's a good case to be made that, so both things. It is both true that some of those, taking it, quote, too far from the conservative point of view, and then two, the conservative point of view of saying we can't change, we have to make society stagnant in order to maintain its coherence. We want, the Bill Buckley vision of, adults, of parents being able to actually relate to their children because they have something in common. It doesn't have to be everything, but something. And that's a legitimate claim. It's just that you don't want to take that vision too far. How do you discover what the too far is? And I think the libertarian, answer to that is, one, zoom out and see what the discussion is and actually take the discussion on its terms. And then two, you got to overlay that with some kind of ethical philosophy about how should people behave towards one another. And that's where things like the non-aggression principle come in. You say, well, okay, how do we discover whether or not, what is the difference between freedom for gay people to get married, transsexual people to be able to have, certain privileges or rights, and pedophilia is a sexual orientation. Where do we discover what's right and wrong about these? How do we divide between those things and discover what is out of bounds? And we're gonna and that is then a dialogue about those things. The conservatives who say, oh, there shouldn't be a dialogue because we've always had it this way, are wrong. But the progressives who say, if you disagree with my vision, you're a backwater, hick who history is going to hate, is also wrong, because there is a line in there where we have to negotiate. And if you're not tracking the pedophilia thing, that's a real philosophy that some people actually believe on the internet, which is where a lot of these things start.
And I remember warning libertarians about this years ago, and everybody was like, we're not going that far. Like, the slippery slope of thing is a thing. Like, there's elements here that we have to be cautious of. Because something that I always kind of, and it's going to sound like me hating on libertarians again, but I do it because I love them. I love the philosophy. I often will get pushback of like, there's this element of inside of libertarian communities of, oh, it's just like, let spontaneous order be spontaneous. It's just like, there's this naturalistic fallacy that exists in that. And I just think it's just a lot of people aren't thinking things through all the way. It's just like just because things happen does not mean good all the time. Like the free market can produce bad outcomes as well. It's like I'm a free market anarchist. Like I like open up the free market. It's like let their freedom thrive. But there's elements of cultural dynamics that need to be continued to be preserved. And there's certain dialogues that need to happen around that, because I think too often we get just roped into this, is the state doing something or is the state not doing something? Like we need to be a little bit more open about other avenues of how society works, because like often we get stuck, and because a lot of people in our circles are policy people, everything's in policy circles, so everything's just like, what is the government doing? And there's and libertarianism is very much a legal philosophy. It doesn't cover the entire picture of life, of how societies operate.
And that's where it gets confused with libertinism and concepts like that, where it actually becomes a proscription for doing whatever you want, not saying, is there a boundary? What is virtue? How one ought to behave? There are things in which case the overall philosophy does produce oughts, right? Unless you have but it's kind of deeper for some people. It's really hard for some people to apply. But you want to say, is it free? Like is it something that is voluntary amongst everybody participating in the thing? Is a question, but that's not the only relevant question. And then like things like aesthetics, I get to have an opinion about things that are broader than just policy questions.
Yes.
Just because I happen to work in that area, or because I'm a policy wonk or a known figure in that area, doesn't mean that when I watched the Wonder Woman movie, I wasn't like, I feel like something's missing. I have an opinion about that, and that's okay.
We should, because this is something that we bounce around quite a bit often, but at some point we should have we should just have a
no government, only talk about cultural stuff.
Talk about, or just like talk about like archetypes and storytelling and that type of stuff. We should have that conversation maybe next podcast, because I think that there'd be a lot of themes, how they relate to society. Nice. I would love that conversation.
Cool.
But yeah.
There's a rich complexity to life that is so much larger than just the government policy question. And what we struggle with sometimes, I think, both in election years, but even beyond that, as Americans, is sometimes we collectivize everything, and we kind of say like, well, someone expressing their opinion is somehow a threat to me, right? Is a problem, and then also like kind of the inverse.
Words are violence, right?
Yeah,
like,
right.
Like that became a thing a few years ago,
right? And the other inverse of that is like never bringing anything up, right? Because you don't discuss religion, politics, or what was the other one? Probably aesthetics, don't bring up.
Nobody says the word.
I know, just philosopher types.
I think it's just religion and politics. You don't talk about religion or politics or at Christmas or whatever,
right, or at the door,
or at Thanksgiving or
in
whatever.
public. Period. Yeah. Which is which is a major problem too. It's a kind of a conservative enunciation of the same thing.
Yeah, I was about to go somewhere with that and I just lost it.
Oh shoot!
Darn, it'll come back maybe.
So have we defined all of our things in case we miss anybody amongst our lingo? So we got emergent order, talked about science, talked about the concept of kind of what you were riffing on, and I don't know how to summarize that in a single, but creative destruction.
Yeah. And
then institutions. What do we mean by institutions?
Well, institutions, like I guess I don't know what like the proper definition, but I'll say what I think in my mind are the institutions are often kind of the guardians of public opinion in society, and like centers of fostering fostering opinion and things like that. So like you'll have like academia as a major institution that's kind of like a pillar of society, because it's where a lot of the research and science operates inside of, right? Like the corporate press in general, kind of largely speaking, is an institution because it's how information is disseminated through society. Like government is an institution of society
with sub-institutions,
with various
the
sub-institutions, right?
Congress is an institution, the presidency, they're both ideas and they're formal things, right?
Yeah.
They're both the
Yeah, that's a good way. Yeah, they're ideas that we've formalized and kind of legitimized, right?
and they exist on both points. Like they're actual literal things. They're literal buildings that are the institution, aka the congressional building.
But the buildings are centered around what at the top of it is an idea.
Right.
It's like it's a concept that we've kind of made up that we're now all just kind of like, this is a thing.
Yeah. Right. Whenever we identify things like where authority comes from, like the authority comes from the people, and that Congress is the embodiment of that power of the people, that's the idea of Congress. It's not a real thing.
It comes from perceived legitimacy.
Right. So where this kind of rubs up against the current dialogue, when the postmodernists and people like of the relativist kind of school of thought and philosophy come along and say, well, those aren't real. These are just people, right? Meeting in a building, telling everyone else what to do and what to believe and all that kind of stuff. That's true. Right, but it misses something. It misses the institution itself and what that means to people as a larger institution. Now, that doesn't mean it's not true, but it's missing a dynamic.
I think that is very much a worthwhile critique. Like, it's a very Nietzschean deconstructionist concept.
Yes.
But I also think something to be layered on top of that for just like understanding the is of the situation is a Frederick Bastiat type of view of perceived legitimacy, or Murray Rothbard talks about this in the Anatomy of the State, of like what makes it real is that people collectively all kind of agree that it's real,
right?
Even though it's technically not like a physical thing, it's an idea. It's like a Platonic world of forms. It's an idea that's popped up,
right?
And
that's an emergent order phenomenon where we all have not consciously, but often collectively, subconsciously decided on these things. Oftentimes without ever investigating them. And that's why it's so important, and that's why that cutting of the strings idea is so important. Like, if you start to take the time to investigate these things with your rational mind, you gain explanatory power about the world that's happening around you. You no longer see the media. If you go in and you have never thought about this before, and you see the media as the arbiter of truth, then you're much more likely to believe propaganda. When it's propaganda.
Well, I was just going to bring up propaganda. Like, that's what makes propaganda so useful for controlling society.
Because it's reliant on the institutional idea of the legitimacy of and the good faith behavior of the media as an institution.
If you want to sell a war, people have to all be bought into this collective idea.
Right. And to de-emotionalize it. We're not talking about any recent wars. We'll talk about the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, exactly.
Or many other situations where the media has really fed into these things. It's a demon that if you read like contemporary media analysis theories and things like that in the academic world, that they're grappling with this all the time, especially after the Iraq War. There's a tremendous amount written about how the media got wrapped up into this thing, and before you knew it, the New York Times and the Washington Post and all these institutions were selling a lie to the American public because they just took the government at their word. Right, and that was because they hadn't zoomed out enough. They hadn't questioned enough of their assumptions about the nature of the world that they live in to be able to see that there's an incentive for the government to lie to people, and that their role is to check that, is to actually stand up for the people and hold the government accountable to facts and of the real world, the actual truth.
I'm pulling up a tweet I just saw because it's very related to this. It was.
We need a Jamie. Hey Jamie, bring up that
Jamie.
tweet.
Jamie.
We are our own Jamie.
Now hiring for free somebody to be our Jamie. Yeah, no. So it was talking about Chomsky. Chomsky's description of establishment media, and Chomsky, communist, somebody that wouldn't agree with us on economics and a lot of things with society, but something I really like Chomsky on is his views of established institutions. And Chomsky had a quote saying, "As effective and powerful ideological institutions that, like talking about the corporate press, is that they're effective and powerful ideological institutions that carry out a system supportive propaganda function by reliance on market forces, internalized assumptions, and self-censorship, and without an overt coercion." And kind of what that is getting at, and I completely agree with it, is like a lot of these elements are free market phenomenon, or they're spontaneous order. Like there's an order that has kind of come to it. You know, you have government forces that try to manipulate things and all these entities, but all of it relies on people's consent, and that's Chomsky's book, right? Is manufactured consent. It all relies on people buying into the belief, which is a religious narrative, right? Like this is accepting things on faith, and that's kind of what we're getting at with skepticism of these things. Is like, be careful with blind faith,
Right.
right?
That and institutions in a vacuum have problems, right? The vacuum created by institutions has to be filled by new things, right? And so we don't want to just. We want to say, like, there are problems with these institutions that they're facing creative destruction. So who is going to be the social entrepreneur to create the new institutions? And the policy entrepreneur? And who's going to actually go out and step out and be brave and embody courage and actually take the arrows to articulate ideas that are unpopular sometimes and to take the opposite side of some of these public debate dialogues. And when they do, it's funny, those people get rewarded a lot. There's a tremendous amount of people who have made their names off of being prosecuted by the mainstream media. Monetize haters, I believe is the technical term.
Frankly, that's what Tom Woods always says.
Which is Eric July.
It came from
the
Eric
OG
first,
of that.
But one of the big problems, and this is why I think it often takes courage. And speaking of our archetypal storytelling, I think it's usually the initial person that does this does not get the credit. It's usually the followers and people that come after him that get the credit. And that's a very John the Baptist to Jesus type of archetypal story narrative. It's Socrates to Aristotle, Socrates to Plato, right? Socrates, things didn't go well for him.
He died old.
He was forced to drink hemlock by the elite institutions of society, right? And then it was his students that rose up afterwards and caused a lot of change when it came to ideas. Same with John the Baptist, got his head cut off. I guess Jesus, it didn't turn out for him well either afterwards. But
did transform society though.
But did transform society.
Yeah.
So it's that's the hard part, is like you're saying these people often get rewarded. I feel not always. In innovation and technology, like you make the new iPhone and you get kind of rewarded. But in a lot of these much deeper philosophical, religious, like idea structures, that person it's usually a future generation that's inspired off of the martyr.
Sometimes, and there are exceptions to
Usually,
that. Adam Smith, for example,
always.
was incredibly popular in his day. And there is.
That's because, and I think maybe one of the reasons for that is we're talking about basically a new society, right there. So there's not all these underlying structures that exist that are preventing Adam Smith from being a big deal. He's kind of one of the starters of it.
Well, I mean, in mobile, Francis Hutchinson was actually the OG of those theories, right? That came before Smith. But the popularizer of those things is the way that you create that. And the other, one more thing, I think to keep in that realm, the people who change the world, from my point of view, are almost always the people who couldn't do anything else. They have no plan B. There is no other way for them to approach the world except through a posture of, no, you change. Transformation of the world happens from people who desire that more than desire anything else. And if you're sitting there saying there's an injustice happening, what cost are you willing to pay to solve that injustice? And if you see something that's wrong with the world and you're unwilling to pay any price to change it, then you don't actually care that much about it. So that's to me, yes, there are personal sacrifices that happen in those things, and often the first person in the line takes all the arrows. But I think many times that first person in line, if they knew the kind of what they would create by that sacrifice, that they would take that every single time. At least I think that's true for John the Baptist. But anyways, kind of heavy, but I think that is Viktor Frankl. So
Man's Search for Meaning.
Logotherapy. This is a guy who was a Nazi
prisoner.
Was not in
Auschwitz. He was in one of the
Dachau.
He was in one of the what's the word? Not the main camp. He was in a side camp basically for most of his internment.
He believed that it was meaning that gave people a sense of purpose, or not that right. The thing that drove people forward in life was meaning, was a sense and pursuit of a meaningful life. that the thing that drove most neuroticism, like negative emotion, the thing that drove most people's sense of despair, especially in the worst conditions, and then inversely, even in the worst conditions possible, like a Nazi prison camp, that there were people who were exceptional and kind-hearted in those moments. And those are the people who had a firm sense of meaning. So if you draw the proscription out of that and you say, what is my life for? What is my purpose? And you say, it is to find and discover an advanced meaning in the world. To discover a thing that brings you meaning and then realize that thing in the real world. And you're like, David, I'm a landscaper. You know? Yeah, me too. I was once too. I'm a carpenter or whatever. You have a meaning. You have a purpose for you to discover and advance in the world. Go do that thing that makes you come alive and makes the world a better place, that reduces suffering, that, makes the world more open. Embody the values that make the world a better place. Before you go out and say, no, I need to change that government policy, I need to change this about society in general through the exercise of violence and political power, first, do that to yourself. First, change yourself to embody those principles. That makes the world a better place, and it's something you can actually control. If you're depressed and sitting at home and you have nothing going for you in life, make your bed. Clean your room, get your stuff together. Prescription.
And this is one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson was such a big deal globally speaking.
Right,
like, best-selling author of the century.
Right.
Like all of this stuff. Right. Was because I think that a lot of people are meaning starved in where society is kind of heading, and. But
to be clear, to finish the thought on Frankl, that's how you prevent Nazism. It isn't through banning free speech. It isn't through keeping Nazis off campus or whatever, project of using the government as a force to prevent that. How you do that is you encourage the individual to realize their potential in a way that makes the world a better place. Because you can't. It's a very, very small group of people, a very, very small group of sociopaths derive meaning from agony of others. Most people derive, almost all, 99% of the population, derive purpose and meaning through love and friendships and mutually beneficial arrangements in which everyone does better off and succeeds. That itself, that world isn't created through institutions, it's created by individuals, and then encouraged and embodied in institutions after the fact.
Well, and this is one of the things with the kind of the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, and I'm also going to kind of take the idea of blowback in society as like from an ideological point of view, is often a lot of the things like restricting people's ability to do whatever, free speech as an example, it breeds this resentment in people. And that resentment kind of becomes a parasitic ideology that just creates this vicious cycle throughout society. And there's like meaning to be found through a resentful like axiom at the base of an ideology. And that's kind of what keeps everything warring with each other. And because now your meaning is always beating the other, right? And like that's not a healthy base for a society.
Right.
But that's kind of, and that's frankly, that's often why empires fall. I think I think at the roots of it is that there's this, these power games that get played because of that resentful undertone of messaging.
So some of it, for a lot of the individuals that play in those circumstances, because I've known them, it's that they've been fighting the battle so long that they forgot why they started.
Yeah.
Right. And all that matters is beating the bad guys who have been the bad guys since they got started in my career, mostly in politics, in the 1990s.
Everything becomes very Machiavellian. And that is the is of politics. Like the is of politics is Machiavellianism, right?
Well, and a tremendous amount of the actors in it, though, aren't in for that reason. Like, they didn't start out that way. Now, some of them do.
No, they started out as in like an intern. Yeah. There's different elements there. There's the people that get in because of that specifically, or in power, prestige, all those elements. And then there's the people that get in because they have a certain vision of society that they want to move towards. So they become an intern for a campaign, and then they work their way up into various institutions or whatever, right?
And they lose who they are.
Yeah, inside of the institutions.
Right. They lose the meaning and the original purpose for it. And that's why, especially in the policy world where I come from, alcoholism so rampant.
Yeah.
And
tobacco use.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff is so crazy.
Speed, methamphetamine, so all those things become very
prevalent because of that. I got started along ideals, and somewhere along the way, I lost who I was. Anchoring people in a sense of like, okay, what is my purpose as an individual? How do I have a statement that I can actually articulate about why what I do is making the world a better place, and then trying to limit the things I do to just those things that make the world a better place, or provide a better place for me to live in, or a better place for someone else to live in, or that I can draw meaning from and realize the potential of myself in that process. And that hope, that like vision for the world and society is not only accomplishable, is not only possible, but it's something that is it's within the reach of any individual person if they're willing to create the sacrifices to make that to happen. But it doesn't happen without sacrifice. It happens because people take risks and they embody the principles and virtues of like courage and integrity to go do that thing.
Well, and it's like Viktor Frankl is very similar to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and we're on this Jordan Peterson line, who like his book became super popular because of Jordan Peterson. I read it because of Jordan Peterson, and I think in a lot of ways it becomes as simple as just don't accept the lie that society portrays. Like if your society's vices and virtues are all flipped on their head, and like normalcy is to pursue these vices that are typically bad for societies, they're what makes societies crumble, then be the insane person. Like be the abnormal. Because if everybody's just going through with this lie, that's how you end up getting Nazi Germany. That's how you get the Soviet Union. That's how you get gulags. Yeah.
To be clear, we're not talking about alcohol as the thing that everyone does that don't do. What we're talking about is embracing a set of ideas.
I'm talking about like ideological vices, and like courage versus cowardice, like that type of, like an Aristotelian kind of Nicomachean ethics type of view.
Well, you gotta unpack that. But yeah, you're not wrong. Yeah. There's exactly, it's by the individual taking up responsibility against the society that transforms it, right? So it's not by saying, oh man, I'm gonna wait for someone else to become brave, and I'll go articulate the thing that I've been waiting for someone to articulate. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a certain stage in life, there's a certain stage in maybe your philosophical life where you need to be consuming other people. Like you need to not talk and listen, right? And there's a certain part of it when you always should be listening, but you got to start talking. And until more people get to that place, we will not see a change. One of the things that always frustrates me is the amount of political policy that is made on Twitter and how much news is about Twitter when an enormous amount of the population isn't engaged in that conversation at all.
Yeah.
Because they don't feel welcome there, or they feel like if they get into that space, unless they have, that they don't have the courage to get into that space to actually articulate alternative ideas or be able to interface with ideas they don't feel comfortable with. That we get that monoculture, right? And that was true way before Twitter started, banning Alex Jones and all that kind of stuff. Twitter's always had this character where it's always been very center left, very metropolitan, all that kind of stuff. So where are we at? 38? Okay. That's on the second part of this.
Well, we had 15 before, so we're going to be coming in an hour soon.
And the construction sounds are getting a little more intense. I think guys wearing steel boots. So wow, heavy podcast.
Well, today. Yeah. Well,
what are you consuming now? Let's draw it down a little bit. Let's get down to some normal people.
What am I consuming right now?
Yeah. What do you?
I've been very on the Albert Camus train over the last year. I've been embracing a lot of absurdism.
What's absurdism?
Absurdism. It's a line of the existentialist thought, which like would probably require an entire podcast to talk about, which very much derives from this meaning conversation, actually, and the Camus absurdist position on the meaning conversation. Camus, it's probably more important to start here. Camus believed that the most important philosophical question is whether or not to commit suicide, because at the end nothing else really matters if you're dead, right? And for him it's a flat out no, and he views there as three options, and he's taking this from Soren Kierkegaard, who's a Danish philosopher and an existentialist, where you have the choice in life when you're presented with the idea of like the world being meaningless and there doesn't seem to be much purpose for you, of like, okay, you can choose the physical suicide route or you can choose the philosophical suicide route, was Kierkegaard's opinion. And the physical suicide is what it sounds like. It's physical death, right? The philosophical suicide is an ideological death. And often people stave that away and try to find meaning by taking a leap of faith into another, you know, it might be a religion or an idea or, you know, like whatever. And people will take a leap of faith to try to give their life some meaning. And Camus' point in that is that in itself is a philosophical suicide, because you're no longer operating with what's true anymore. And he took a third route, which is just rebel. And that's kind of like, in my eyes, that's kind of what the whole premise of this podcast is in a lot of ways, is you're rebelling, and we're taking a political atheist kind of stance of embracing the absurdities of the world and trying to create out of it. And that's where you can find some sense of meaning, is in the creation process and in enacting the act of creation in the world, right? So like engaging in art and, you know, writing and podcasting and things like that. These are elements of dealing with the absurdities of the world and kind of taking that act of rebellion in society. And that's kind of, I've been engaged in that a lot. That's kind of what I've been consuming is a lot of his works and a lot of works similar to it. Kafka is another person I've been kind of consuming a little bit, who has similar opinions, but I think they're a little bit more shallower than Camus are. But
Very
yeah.
cool.
What about you?
I've been reading Charles Koch's new book.
Yeah.
And Brian Oakes, Believe in People.
Which you just gave me.
Which is really good and enjoyable. And it's a lot about what we're talking about, too, in the sense that it's about entrepreneurs who change the world, not just through business, but through social entrepreneurism, and what that requires, and the virtues that requires, and how that encourages a virtuous society from the bottom up, because the solutions of the world don't happen top down. They happen bottom up.
Well, and actually, and this might be a good spot to end it on the Camus train. Something that you just said was very reminiscent. I'm going to butcher this quote, but I'll be paraphrasing it. Is that he said something along the lines, I think in The Myth of Sisyphus, of that societies often crumble because of what's left unsaid. Because everybody's saying things, everybody's like, you know, purporting things, but they're usually just following the crowd, and the crowd usually is just filled with untruth. So be that person that says what's unpopular, because it might be the thing that saves society.
Bye.